The desert wind that once blew across the trailer park had given way to Minnesota's bitter cold, carrying the scent of pine and ice rather than dust and motor oil. Snow piled against the row of faded aluminum homes that stood like forgotten sentinels, their windows frosted and curtains bleached beyond recognition by years of harsh weather. Inside one of them, Sarah Mitchell was finishing her third cup of instant coffee, eyes fixed on the stack of unpaid bills spread across the small kitchen table, fingers tracing the edges of red stamped notices as if touch might somehow transform their demands. The hum of the ancient refrigerator filled the silence, interrupted only by the ticking of the wall clock that had long since lost its minute hand. It was 6 in the morning, or perhaps 7. Sarah no longer trusted that clock anyway. Her hands were rough from industrial cleaners and bleach. Every night she came home from the Pinewood diner with her clothes smelling of grease, only to walk a mile through snow to the wash and fold for 4 more hours of work. Two jobs, neither paying enough to hold her life together, yet she clung to both like a lifeline in the unforgiving Minnesota winter. The small savings she had left after her husband's funeral had been shrinking faster than she could replenish them. Sometimes she thought she could still hear Marcus's voice in the trailer, murmuring about better days ahead, though those promises had vanished like breath in cold air the day his heart suddenly stopped 3 years ago. Emma sat on the floor with a sketchbook open, tracing the outline of a grand staircase she'd seen in an architectural magazine. She was 17, tall and quietly determined, her blonde hair tied in a knot that looked effortless, but wasn't. The girl had inherited her mother's patience and her father's sharpness of thought, and when she sketched, her face softened, as if she could already see a world beyond these thin walls. Her dream was to design spaces that breathed life into forgotten places. But for now, her pencils were dull, and the pages of her sketchbook smelled faintly of fabric softener, because they'd been stored too close to Sarah's work clothes. Thomas, her younger brother, had turned 11 that November. His world was made of circuit boards, copper wires, and half-broken gadgets he collected from the junkyard behind the trailer park. The boy could spend hours fixing things others had discarded. A transistor radio with missing buttons, a toaster with frayed cords, a toy robot without its voice box. Often when Sarah returned home late, she'd find him asleep amid a constellation of screwdrivers and pliers, a small flashlight still glowing beside his cheek. He reminded her of his father in ways that made her chest ache. A boy who could make broken things work again, just by believing they weren't beyond saving. Outside, the neighbor's German shepherd barked at the falling snow. The noise brought Sarah back to the present, to the cracked surface of her table, and the eviction notice pinned above the sink, written in cold bureaucratic language. Final warning. Payment due or eviction in 7 days. She'd read it so many times the words had lost their power to quicken her pulse. It was merely another reminder of a truth she already carried. There wasn't much left to lose. She folded the paper slowly, tucked it into her pocket, and exhaled a cloud of vapor in the poorly insulated trailer. Her car, an aging Ford pickup that protested each time it started, sat outside like a frost-covered sentinel, waiting for one last journey. The gas gauge hadn't touched half a tank in months. She had spent the previous night listing small items for sale online. An old sewing machine, a spare coffee maker, a few pieces of costume jewelry that had belonged to her mother. The offers that came in were laughable, but even the smallest amount could stretch a few more meals, a few more nights, with electricity. Yet beneath the exhaustion and the arithmetic of survival, something in Sarah refused to surrender. She had not yet learned how to give up completely. Each night when the children were asleep, she would sit at her narrow kitchen table with her laptop, the screen's blue glow illuminating her face as she scrolled through pages of foreclosures and auctions. Most were absurd, vacation properties beyond imagination, acres of farmland she would never see. But the ritual gave her comfort, like peering into lives where the world hadn't fallen apart. That night, as the clock crept past midnight and the wind howled through the poorly sealed windows, she found the listing that would change everything. It was buried deep in a government surplus website under a category called Abandoned Properties, Final Notice Sale. The title was short and strange, written in the dry language of official records: Abandoned Resort Lodge, Silver Pines. Property seized, unclaimed, public auction, starting bid 170. At first she laughed softly, the sound strange in the quiet trailer. A resort lodge for less than $200, it had to be an error. But curiosity made her click. The description was brief, almost careless. Structure located near Pinewood Lake, formerly known as Silver Pines Lodge, built circa 1952, closed after fire damage in 1979. Current condition hazardous, heavy snow accumulation, no utilities. Buyer assumes all liability. Below it, a single photo, grainy and colorless, showed a massive timber and stone structure, its roof partially collapsed under snow. A faded wooden sign that read Silver Pines, where dreams endure forever. She stared at the screen longer than she meant to. There was something about the building, even in its ruin, that held a whisper of dignity. It was the kind of place she could imagine her husband once talking about back when he'd dream aloud of running his own business, a repair shop, a small hotel, anything that could belong to them. Her fingers hovered over the mouse, her pulse beating slower than usual. $170. A risk small enough to be ridiculous, yet large enough to feel like a dare from the universe itself. She checked the terms again. Transfer immediate upon payment. No back taxes, no current liens. The words might as well have been a lifeline thrown into deep water. The next morning, Sarah took the bus into Pinewood to speak with Gerald Davidson, a retired bank manager who volunteered legal advice at the community center. The old man peered at her printout through thick glasses, the aroma of pipe tobacco clinging to his cardigan, despite the no smoking signs. Places like this sometimes end up legitimate. Old structures forfeited to the state when no heir comes forward. You'd be responsible for whatever you find inside, but legally, yes, it's possible. Though I'd question why you'd want it. Possible. That was all Sarah needed to hear. She walked back through the snow with the paper clutched in her hand, the idea growing with every step. For years, she had been reacting, patching, surviving, waiting. This was the first thing that felt like a decision she could own. That night, she took out the small metal box she kept under her bed. Inside lay what remained of her savings, rolled neatly into rubber-banded bundles. Her husband's old wedding band lay atop them, dull with age. She set it aside, counted the money twice, and with a deep breath, sent the payment. The confirmation email arrived minutes later. Transaction approved. Transfer pending. Property Silver Pines Lodge. The next few days moved like a dream. Emma's skepticism faded when she saw the picture. "We could make it beautiful," she said softly, tracing the outline of the broken roof with her finger. Thomas, though too young to understand real estate, was thrilled at the idea of fixing a whole building. For the first time in months, the trailer was filled with conversation that wasn't about bills or repairs. Eleanor Watson from next door shook her head when Sarah told her they were leaving. "You're throwing away your last dollars on a fairy tale," she muttered, though her eyes held something like admiration. "Just don't freeze to death out there in the wilderness." They packed what they could. Blankets, canned food, Thomas's toolbox, Emma's sketchbooks, Sarah's few dresses, and work uniforms. The rest they left behind. When Sarah looked around the small home for the last time, she didn't feel sadness, only the strange calm that comes when one chapter truly ends. She unplugged the space heater, wiped the counters, and locked the door behind her. The early morning air bit at their faces as they loaded the pickup. The truck groaned but started coughing, white exhaust into the gray dawn. The children climbed in, half awake, half hoping. In the rearview mirror, Sarah watched the trailer park recede, the flickering sign by the entrance covered in icicles, like the past itself had frozen solid and could no longer follow them. They drove for hours, the landscape growing wilder and more isolated. Endless pine forests stretched on either side of the snow-covered road. Abandoned gas stations and half-collapsed barns appeared occasionally, ghosts of rural prosperity, long faded. Lily photographed these ruins, framing them against the white sky. Thomas counted the miles between plow tracks, his breath fogging the passenger window. Sarah kept her eyes on the road ahead, her hands steady on the wheel despite the occasional ice patch. The silence between them was not empty now. It was full of possibility. Somewhere past noon, Thomas rummaged through the glove compartment and found an old cassette player that must have belonged to his father. Inside was a tape labeled simply Pines. He turned it over curiously. Sarah took it from him, gently smiled faintly, and set it back. Later, she said, though she wasn't sure why the name made her uneasy. As the sun began its early winter descent, a sign appeared by the roadside, half buried in snow, but legible. Pinewood Township, 12 miles. Emma raised her phone to take a picture, but Sarah told her not to bother. The winter swallowed markers faster than it did travelers. The sky deepened into cobalt and violet, as they approached what looked like a cluster of distant shapes rising from the snow-covered ground. From far away, Sarah thought it was a mirage created by twilight shadows. But as they drew closer, the shapes resolved into walls, chimneys, and a towering wooden structure with letters missing. Silver Pines Lodge. The name gleamed faintly under the dying light, and for a moment she could almost imagine it alive again. Music and laughter spilling from its doors. She parked the truck at the edge of what must have been a circular driveway, now buried under 3 feet of snow. The silence was absolute. The children stared in awe. Before them stood the skeleton of what had once been a palace. Timber beams blackened by old fire windows shattered the massive entrance, partially obscured by a snowdrift. The wind sighed through the broken doors, carrying the faint metallic rattle of loose hinges. Sarah stepped out first. The snow crunched under her boots as she sank to mid-calf. She approached the building, slowly, her breath clouding before her. She ran her fingers along the cold surface of a massive stone pillar, feeling the grain of frost and time. Behind her, the children waited uncertain. She turned to them, her face calm, but her eyes burning with quiet resolve. This is it. The last sunlight flickered across the wooden sign, catching the gold leaf remnants of letters just as the wind shifted. For a brief instant, Silver Pines shimmered as if woken from a long sleep. Sarah's breath caught. Whether it was a trick of light or something deeper, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that for the first time in years, she felt the pull of something like hope, a door not yet opened. Somewhere deep within the lodge's walls, the air stirred as if remembering the sound of music long gone. The forest grew still around them, waiting. The past had not yet spoken, but it had begun to breathe again. The next morning broke with thin pearl-colored light filtering through clouds heavy with snow. Sarah awoke in the cab of the truck, her neck stiff, her mind fogged with dreams of warm halls and dancing figures that vanished before she could name them. Emma was still asleep in the passenger seat, her head resting against the window, a sketchbook clutched to her chest. Thomas had built himself a nest of blankets in the back seat, a flashlight still gripped in his small hand. The air outside was bitter cold, but the pale winter sun promised a clear day. Sarah stepped out and stretched her cramped limbs, the snow crunching beneath her boots as she looked up at the structure that loomed before them. Silver Pines stood silent and watchful in the morning light, its enormous size more apparent now. Up close, it was both majestic and broken, a wounded giant of timber and stone. The main building was 3 stories tall, built in the Grand Lodge style of the mid-century, with massive pine beams and river stone walls. The facade still bore traces of elegance beneath the scars of fire and decades of harsh Minnesota winters. Sunlight glinted off icicles hanging from the eaves, catching on shards of glass, still clinging to window frames. The grand portico above the entrance was carved with patterns of pine boughs and antlers, symbols of wilderness luxury from another era. The old sign above the doors, "Where dreams endure forever," hung at a crooked angle, letters half gone, the wood warped by seasons of snow and thaw. For a fleeting second, the word dreams seemed to flicker in the morning light before going still again. Sarah pushed against the massive front door. It moved with a deep groan, ice cracking around the frame as hinges protested after years of disuse. Inside, the air was cold, but strangely not as frigid as outside, dense with the scent of old timber stone and something else, something older, like burned cedar and forgotten cologne. They entered carefully, each footstep echoing in the vastness. The light from the doorway cut a golden path across the marble floor, illuminating specks of dust and frost that swirled like tiny stars. The first thing they saw was the grand hall, enormous and frozen in time. Once this place must have blazed with chandeliers and laughter, with the clinking of glasses and the warmth of stone fireplaces. Now it was a cathedral of silence. The ceiling, once adorned with hand-painted wooden panels, was cracked and water-damaged. Fragments of crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears from exposed beams. Rows of tables stood in perfect stillness, their surfaces dulled by dust and spotted with water damage. The faces of painted wildlife smiled eternally from the old murals on the walls, their colors muted by time. A grand staircase curved upward from the lobby, its wooden railings intact but dulled by years of neglect. Sarah ran her palm along one of the banisters. It was cold, unyielding, and surprisingly smooth under the layer of dust. Somewhere in her chest, beneath the fatigue, she felt a faint tremor of awe. Emma wandered ahead, camera in hand, already documenting everything. She photographed the cracked mirrors, the fallen ceiling panels, the way sunlight caught on the remnants of a golden mural behind what had once been the reception desk. To her, this wasn't just a ruin. It was a story waiting to be rewritten. She crouched near an old chair, tracing her fingers over the faded upholstery, and murmured that the patterns could be restored, the wood refinished. For a moment, Sarah saw in her daughter's eyes the same fierce light she had once seen in her husband's, when he talked about building something lasting. The same defiant belief that what was broken could still be made whole. Thomas had already vanished deeper into the hall, drawn by the silent promise of mechanical mysteries. Sarah called his name, and his voice came back from the distance, full of wonder. He was crouched near what had once been a grand piano, running his fingers over the exposed strings. The boy had found a silver dollar-sized token, still gleaming faintly under decades of dust. On one side, the inscription read, "Silver Pines, 1979." And on the other, a sunburst symbol with intertwined letters V and R. He slipped it into his pocket like a secret treasure. Sarah followed him, her boots leaving shallow prints in the dust. She tried to imagine the last night this place had been alive. The tables full, the band playing, the laughter, the sharp scent of pine fires and fine whiskey. She could almost hear it if she let herself listen long enough. The echo of a saxophone from the far end of the ballroom, the murmur of conversations, the soft notes of a piano. But there was something else too under the surface of memory, a faint hum that made her uneasy. The silence in this building was not empty. It was holding its breath. They reached what appeared to be the main reception area, where two wide doors led to what must have been the manager's office. The nameplate had long since fallen off, leaving only a pair of tarnished screws. The door itself resisted, at first swollen by years of moisture and cold, then gave way with a deep crack. The room inside was smaller than Sarah expected, the ceiling lower, the windows facing the frozen lake beyond. A large mahogany desk stood in the center, half collapsed under the weight of a fallen ceiling beam. Behind it, the wall bore a long, black scorch mark that stretched up to the ceiling like a reaching hand. The smell of old fire was stronger here. On the far side of the room sat a wall safe, massive and square, built into the stone fireplace. The paint on its surface had bubbled and peeled, revealing the raw steel beneath. Sarah knelt beside it, brushing away decades of dust. There was no handle, no visible keyhole, only a circular dial fused solid by rust. The air around it was strangely cold, colder than the rest of the room, and when she laid her hand on the metal, she felt a faint vibration, as if the building itself was breathing through it. "Mom, what is it?" Emma asked from the doorway, her voice cautious. Sarah straightened, frowning slightly. "A safe," she said. "Locked for decades, probably empty now." Yet she didn't move away. Something about it unsettled her. The blackened mark on the wall, the half-melted brass lamp beside it, the cracked glass in the windows. It all seemed to circle back to this one point, as though the fire had started right here. They explored the rest of the main floor in silence. The walls bore layers of old wallpaper, curling at the edges, faded from forest green to gray. In the enormous dining room, Thomas found a stack of playing cards melted together into a single block, the edges fused like stone. Emma discovered a ballroom with a stage still intact, the curtains frozen in mid-rise, as if the last performance had been interrupted mid-act. Sarah found a smaller room with a massive stone fireplace, shelves of books, warped by moisture but still standing, and leather chairs arranged in a circle. A private lounge of some kind, she thought, running her finger along the spines of books, with titles still legible. Business directories, investment guides, political memoirs. When the winter sun began to sink behind the pines, the lodge grew darker, shadows stretching across the dusty floors. They decided to spend another night in the truck, not yet ready to claim a space inside. Thomas insisted on bringing his tools in first thing tomorrow. He was certain he could get some of the electrical systems working again. That night, Sarah sat awake long after the children had fallen asleep, watching the outline of silver pines under the moonlight. The clouds had cleared and stars glittered above the damaged roof like splinters of ice. At first, she thought she imagined it, the soft glow that pulsed behind one of the upper windows. It was weak, almost like a reflection of moonlight on glass. Then it flickered again, bright enough to be unmistakable. One of the lights inside the building, on what appeared to be the second floor, had come to life for a few seconds, burning with a faint amber hue. Sarah stared, her hand frozen on the steering wheel. There was no power connected to the building. She had checked the electrical panels earlier that day. Everything was dead. The wires corroded, the breakers rusted shut. Yet there it was, an echo of light, glowing as if it had never gone out. She told herself it must be the moonlight playing tricks, but deep down she knew better. Silver Pines was not entirely abandoned. It was waiting. The next morning, Sarah drove into Pinewood to buy supplies: flashlights, batteries, gloves, bottled water, and basic tools. The local hardware store was a small, cluttered place that smelled of sawdust and machine oil. The elderly clerk, a man with sun-spotted hands and a plaid flannel shirt, raised his eyebrows when she mentioned Silver Pines. "That old place," he said slowly, his Minnesota accent stretching the words. "You mean to say it's open again?" She explained that she'd purchased it through the state auction. He gave a short, nervous laugh and told her that most folks around there avoided it. "Used to be the crown jewel of the county," he said, his voice dropping. "Fire took it down fast, and plenty strange stories before that. Never found the owner after did. The name was Reynolds or Richards, something with an R." Sarah didn't answer. She paid, thanked him, and left. As she was loading supplies into her truck, she noticed a black SUV parked across the street, its windows tinted. A man in an expensive-looking overcoat watching her. When she looked directly at him, he turned and walked into the town hall building. When she returned to Silver Pines, the lodge looked the same as she had left it, silent and imposing under the midday sun. But as she stepped inside, she felt a shift in the air, a subtle difference, like walking into a room someone had just vacated. The dust on the floor near the grand staircase bore fresh footprints that weren't hers or the children's. She crouched, studying them. They led toward what had been the dining area, then vanished. She glanced up, her heart quickening, but saw nothing except sunlight spilling through the cracks in the roof. Emma was upstairs photographing the third-floor gallery. Thomas was in what had once been the kitchen, tapping the old pipes to see which ones still had integrity. Sarah called for them to stay close, though she didn't explain why. By afternoon, they had begun clearing debris from the main hall, piling broken furniture and fallen ceiling panels near the entrance. Lily dusted off a cracked mirror and propped it against the wall. For a brief moment, it reflected the lobby in a way that made the space look whole again, as though time had folded backward. Thomas discovered that beneath layers of dust, the grand piano was largely intact, its soundboard uncompromised despite the broken legs. Sarah decided they would try to clear one section of the building, perhaps just the private lounge with the fireplace, to make it habitable while they worked. It was too early to plan more than that. Silver Pines was enormous, its halls leading off like veins through darkness and snow-filled rooms. Yet she couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched not by people, but by the building itself. That night, they brought blankets and sleeping bags inside, making camp in the private lounge. Thomas got the fireplace working, and soon the smell of burning pine filled the room, driving away the damp chill. The dancing flames cast long shadows on the walls, making the bookshelves seem to shift and breathe. Emma sketched by firelight, designing renovations with quick, confident strokes. Thomas dismantled an old clock he'd found, spreading gears and springs on a blanket, his face intent. Sarah stepped out to bring in more firewood from the truck. The night was clear and bitterly cold, stars hard as diamonds above the snow-covered roof. As she gathered split logs from the bed of the pickup, she heard the crunch of tires on snow. Headlights swept across the driveway, illuminating the front of the lodge in harsh white light. A large black SUV, the same one she'd seen in town, pulled to a stop. A man stepped out, tall, heavy-set, in his early 60s, with thinning gray hair and a coat that cost more than Sarah's truck. He approached with the confident stride of someone used to being obeyed, his breath clouding in the freezing air. "Mrs. Mitchell Wallace Montgomery," he said, extending a gloved hand that she didn't take. "I'm the mayor of Pinewood. I understand you've acquired this property." He glanced at the building with barely disguised covetousness. Sarah nodded, suddenly aware of how isolated they were. Miles from the nearest neighbor, in a building with no phone service, her children inside. Montgomery smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "This is quite a hazard you have purchased. Township's been trying to condemn it for years. I'd like to make you an offer. $5,000 cash. You'd make a tidy profit, and my development company would take this liability off your hands." Sarah's instinct was to accept immediately. The money would solve so many problems. But something in the man's tone, in the way his eyes kept drifting to the building rather than meeting her gaze, made her hesitate. "Why would you pay that much for a ruin?" Montgomery's smile tightened. Let's just say I have sentimental reasons. My family has history with this place. I'd hate to see it deteriorate further. His tone shifted, hardened. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Mitchell, Silver Pines has a troubled past, not a safe place for a woman alone with children. The township has regulations about inhabiting condemned buildings. It would be a shame if your family had to face the elements while inspectors determine the safety. The threat was thinly veiled. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. I appreciate your concern, Mr. Montgomery, but we're staying. His face darkened. He handed her a business card. Think it over. My offer expires in 48 hours. After that, I can't guarantee how the township will respond to squatters. He returned to his SUV and drove away, tires spinning on ice. Sarah stood holding the firewood, her heart pounding. The mayor's interest confirmed what she'd begun to suspect. Silver Pines was more than just an abandoned resort. It held something valuable enough to make a powerful man nervous. Inside, she didn't mention the encounter to the children. They ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated over the fire, the warmth bringing color back to their cheeks. As they prepared for sleep, Thomas set up battery-powered lanterns around the room. Emma arranged the sleeping bags in a circle near the hearth. A knock at the front door made them all freeze. Sarah motioned for the children to stay put and took a flashlight, making her way through the dark hall to the entrance. She opened it cautiously to find an elderly man standing in the snow, his breath visible in the beam of her light. He was tall and lean with a weathered face and sharp blue eyes, perhaps 70 years old, wearing a worn parka and wool hat. Frank Winters, he introduced himself. Heard there were lights at the old lodge. Had to see for myself. His voice was deep musical somehow, with a slight rasp. Sarah hesitated, then invited him in. As he stepped into the hall, his eyes moved over everything with the gaze of recognition, not discovery. Used to play saxophone here back in the glory days, he explained as they walked to the lounge. Every Saturday night from 58 to 79, right up until the fire. His hand brushed against the wall as if greeting an old friend. When they reached the lounge, he smiled at the children, but kept his distance, standing by the doorway, as if unsure of his welcome. You bought it then? From the state, Frank asked, warming his hands by the fire. Sarah nodded, explaining the auction, the price, the strange coincidence of it all. Frank's expression grew serious. Nothing about Silver Pines is coincidence, Mrs. Mitchell. This place has been waiting for someone. Just didn't expect it would be a family. He told them how the lodge had been built by Victor Reynolds, a timber and mining magnate, in 1952. It quickly became the most exclusive resort in northern Minnesota, hosting politicians, celebrities, business leaders. The ballroom had featured the most sought-after musicians, the dining room, the finest chefs. Then came the fire in July 1979. Most folks said it was electrical. Frank continued, his eyes reflecting firelight. But those of us who worked here knew better. There was a special room, they called it the green room. Private meetings only, Reynolds and his inner circle. Night of the fire, there was a big gathering there. Raised voices, then the alarms. By the time the township's volunteer firefighters arrived, half the building was gone. Sarah felt a chill despite the fire's warmth. Where was this green room? Frank's gaze turned to the wall behind the desk. Lower level. They sealed it after. Makes you wonder what's on the other side of that wall, doesn't it? Later, after Frank had gone and the children were asleep, Sarah returned to the office alone. She moved quietly, her flashlight beam cutting through the dark. The beam passed over the desk, the cracked leather chair, the safe embedded in the wall. Everything was motionless, shrouded in decades of stillness. And then, just as she reached the blackened wall, the flashlight dimmed. She tapped it once, twice, and it flickered back to life just in time for her to see in the reflection of a broken window a figure standing in the doorway. A man in a dark suit, his face indistinct, watching her. The image vanished when she spun around. The corridor was empty. The only sound was ice cracking somewhere in the distant eaves. Sarah's breath came shallow and quick, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stepped closer to the window, scanning the shadows, but there was nothing, only her own reflection, pale and wide-eyed. She forced herself to breathe, to steady her hands. This was no haunting, she told herself. It was exhaustion, imagination, tricks of the mind in an old building. Still, as she turned off the flashlight and stood in the darkness for a moment longer, she thought she heard it. The faint rhythmic chime of ice crystals falling onto a metal surface, like frozen tears, counting seconds that never passed. The next morning, while the children explored the upper floors, Sarah knelt by the office safe again, studying it more carefully. The combination dial was rusted in place, but the frame showed a small rectangular depression below it, a keyhole perhaps for a master key. She ran her fingers around the edges, feeling for any mechanism that might release it. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned to find Emma standing in the doorway, her camera hanging around her neck. "I developed some of the photos I took yesterday," Emma said, handing Sarah a stack of Polaroids. "The light in here makes interesting shadows." Sarah flipped through the images. The grand staircase, the ballroom's broken stage, the dining room with tables arranged as if waiting for guests. But one photo made her pause. It was a shot of the main lobby taken the previous afternoon, sunlight cutting across the floor. In the far corner behind a fallen chandelier, a blur of motion. Too tall to be a reflection, too defined to be dust. A shadow in the shape of a man standing as though he had never left. Sarah said nothing to Emma. She only told her to stay close as they worked. Silver Pines was waking up, and whatever slept inside its walls was beginning to remember them. That afternoon, as they cleared debris from the dining room, a truck pulled up outside. Not Montgomery's sleek SUV, but an old pickup similar to Sarah's. A group of men climbed out carrying tools. Frank Winters was among them, along with four others, all in their 60s or older. The hardware store clerk was there, as was a thin man with carpenter's suspenders and two others Sarah didn't recognize. "Thought you could use some help," Frank said simply. "Boys and I used to work here. Might as well put our backs into something useful again." Sarah didn't ask how they knew she'd be working today. News traveled fast in small towns, and Silver Pines had always had its watchers. The men set to work with quiet efficiency, clearing snow from the entrances, boarding broken windows, assessing damage with the practiced eyes of those who had built things all their lives. By sundown, they had made more progress than Sarah could have managed in a week. The dining room was cleared, the worst of the roof leaks temporarily patched, the fireplace in the main hall cleaned and pronounced safe to use. As darkness fell, the men gathered their tools to leave. One of them, who had introduced himself only as Dean, stopped in the lobby and looked up at the ceiling, where a chandelier still hung somehow intact after all these years. "I used to repair these," he said quietly. "Back when it was all lights and wealth." His voice carried a strange tenderness, as though speaking to an old lover. Sarah listened, not wanting to interrupt. Dean told her how Silver Pines had been the pride of 3 counties in the 50s and 60s. People drove from Chicago just to spend a weekend here to see the shows and dance in the ballroom. They said it was untouchable, he murmured. But every place like this hides something rotten behind the shine. He gestured toward the blackened walls near the office and gave a bitter laugh. "I guess the fire proved that right." That night, after the men had gone, Sarah, Emma, and Thomas sat in the main hall, a new fire blazing in the massive stone hearth. The flames cast long shadows across the marble floor, bringing momentary life to the faded murals on the walls. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, hissing against the windows like whispered conversations. Sarah stared into the fire, thinking of Montgomery's threat and the strange footprints she'd found. Tomorrow she would need to go back into town to research the lodge's history more thoroughly, to understand what she had stumbled into. But tonight, the warmth and the small progress they had made was enough. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, examining the token he had found, polishing it with the edge of his shirt until the letters V and R gleamed in the firelight. "You know what I think," he said. "I think we were supposed to find this place." Emma nodded, looking up from her sketchbook, where she had been designing renovations for the lobby. "It's like it was waiting for us," she added. "I know that sounds weird, but I can feel it." Sarah didn't answer. Her eyes had been drawn to something on the wall behind the reception desk, something she hadn't noticed before. She crossed the room slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. There, half hidden behind a fallen ceiling panel, was a framed photograph. She lifted it carefully, brushing away decades of dust. The glass was cracked, the image beneath, smoke damage but still visible. It showed 2 men standing in front of Silver Pines on what appeared to be its opening day. The lodge behind them was pristine, a ribbon stretched across the entrance. One man she didn't recognize, tall, broad-shouldered in an expensive suit. The other made her heart stop. Though younger than in the single photo she had of him, the face was unmistakable. Her father-in-law, Robert Mitchell, a man she had never met, but whose features had passed directly to her husband and now to Thomas. The 2 men were smiling, shaking hands, glasses of champagne raised in a toast. She turned the frame over with trembling fingers. On the back, written in faded ink, "My partner, Robert Mitchell, and his family, 1975. Sarah sank into a nearby chair, the photograph clutched in her hands. Her husband had rarely spoken of his father, saying only that he had died when Marcus was very young. He had mentioned once offhandedly that the man had a gift for seeing potential where others saw ruin, but that was all. She had never pressed for more, respecting the silence that surrounded the subject. Now that silence was taking shape, forming a shadow that stretched backward into the very walls of Silver Pines. She slipped the photograph into her pocket and said nothing to the children, not yet. They were too young to carry the weight of questions she herself didn't understand. But as she stood to add another log to the fire, she felt a strange pressure in her chest, as if the building itself was waiting for her to uncover something. The mayor's interest, the sealed room Frank had mentioned, the footprints, the coal safe with its missing key, they were all threads of the same unfinished tapestry. That night, the wind rose moaning through the broken sections of roof and rattling the boarded windows. The temperature dropped further, and they huddled near the fire, wrapped in every blanket they had brought. Emma fell asleep first, then Thomas, his small tools still clutched in his hand, as he dreamed of fixing broken things. Sarah stayed awake, feeding the fire and listening to the building creak and settle. Once she thought she heard footsteps on the floor above, slow, deliberate steps that crossed from one end of the ceiling to the other. Another time she was certain she heard the faint notes of a saxophone, so distant it might have been the wind finding the right broken window to whistle through. But it was what she saw as the fire burned down to embers that finally confirmed her suspicions. In the doorway leading to the grand staircase, a figure stood watching, a man in a dark suit, his face in shadow. He remained perfectly still, as though waiting for her to speak first. Sarah rose slowly, her throat dry. The figure didn't move. "Who are you?" she whispered. The figure remained silent, but she thought she saw it raise a hand, gesturing toward the office, toward the safe with its secrets. Then as the wax ember in the fireplace collapsed into ash, the shape dissolved into darkness, leaving Sarah alone with her sleeping children and the absolute certainty that Silver Pines had called them here for a purpose. Outside, the snow fell harder, covering their tracks, erasing the boundary between the lodge and the white wilderness that surrounded it. By morning, the world would be transformed again, the past hidden beneath a fresh layer of silence. But Sarah Mitchell knew now that silence was merely another language, and Silver Pines had many stories yet to tell. Morning light filtered through the boarded windows, casting striped patterns across the dust-covered floors of Silver Pines Lodge. Thomas knelt beside an exposed section of wiring in what had once been the reception area, his small hands moving with surprising confidence. He had spent the early hours exploring the electrical system, tracing circuits that hadn't carried power in decades. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he examined the severed wires. "These weren't damaged by the fire, Mom." Thomas pointed to clean cuts in the copper wires, too precise to be accidental. "Look at these edges. Someone cut them with wire cutters. They're not frayed or melted like they would be from overheating. The insulation is sliced, not burned away." Sarah crouched beside her son, squinting at the evidence. She ran her finger along the clean copper edge, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the walls. Thomas had confirmed what she'd begun to suspect: the fire hadn't been an accident. The electrical panels in the basement tell the same story. Thomas continued his analysis with the methodical precision that often made Sarah forget he was only 11. The main breakers weren't tripped. They were deliberately switched off before the fire. Someone wanted this place to burn and made it look like an electrical failure. Outside trucks began arriving, local men Frank had recruited to help clear debris. Sarah had spent her last dollars hiring them, a gamble that felt increasingly necessary as the scale of renovation became apparent. The men filed in wearing insulated work clothes and carrying tools that had seen decades of use. They nodded respectfully to Sarah, their eyes scanning the interior with the calculating gaze of craftsmen assessing a challenge. A heavy-set man with a salt and pepper beard stepped forward. "Jim Erickson, been a contractor around these parts since before this place burned. Frank says you need help making this old girl livable again." His weathered hand gestured toward the damaged ceiling. "We'll start by securing the structure. Can't have that roof collapsing on you folks when the next snow comes." The men spread through the building with quiet efficiency, measuring, testing, calling to each other in the shorthand language of experienced workers. Jim guided Sarah through the main hall, pointing out structural weaknesses, explaining the building's anatomy, like a doctor diagnosing a patient. That's old-growth pine in those beams. They don't make them like that anymore. 3 feet thick could last another century if we treat the rot and fire damage. He knocked against a wall, listening to the sound it produced. This is lath and plaster over stone. You want to know if a wall's structural or decorative. The solid ones sound dead hollow. One's echo. He demonstrated the difference, showing Sarah how to identify weight-bearing walls. While the men worked, Emma documented the existing structure, photographing every corner, measuring dimensions, creating a detailed floor plan. Her architectural instincts, though untrained, proved remarkably accurate. She identified spaces where the exterior dimensions didn't match the interior, places where walls seemed suspiciously thick or corridors ended abruptly. "I think there are hidden rooms, Mom." Emma spread her sketches across the reception desk. "The measurements don't add up. There's at least 15 feet unaccounted for between this wall and the exterior stone." Sarah had learned to trust her daughter's spatial awareness. They began tapping walls systematically, listening for the hollow sound Jim had described. In what had been the hotel bar, Sarah's knuckles produced a distinctly different tone from a section of ornately paneled wall. The men brought a stud finder, confirming a framework of metal rather than wood behind the paneling. Thomas, meanwhile, had made another discovery. He called them to the kitchen, where he'd been examining the plumbing system. "Mom, there are 2 separate water lines running through the building." He pointed to copper pipes of different diameters. "The thinner ones go to all the normal places, bathrooms, kitchen, fire sprinklers. But these larger ones," he traced a thick pipe that disappeared into the floor. "They go straight down, not connected to anything up here. They must lead to something underneath us, something that needed its own water supply." That afternoon, Sarah drove into Pinewood again, this time heading for the local library. The building was small but well-maintained, a brick structure with large windows and a worn welcome sign. Inside, the warmth was immediate and comforting after the chill of Silver Pines. The librarian, Martha Jennings, was an elderly woman with sharp eyes behind wire-frame glasses and fingers stained with book dust. "I'm researching Silver Pines Lodge." Sarah explained her purchase, watching as Martha's expression shifted from polite interest to guarded concern. Martha led her to a back room filled with newspaper archives, town records, and local history books. The Silver Pines fire was big news around here, still is whenever it comes up. Martha pulled out bound volumes of old newspapers, carefully turning yellowed pages until she found what she sought. July 16, 1979. Inferno at Silver Pines, 3 dead. 2 missing. The article described how the fire had started in the early morning hours, spreading quickly through the resort's west wing. The photographs showed firefighters battling towering flames against the night sky. The once Grand Lodge transformed into a blazing pyre. Victor Reynolds, the lodge's owner, was listed as missing, along with his business partner, Robert Mitchell. Sarah's finger froze on the name, though she'd expected to find it. 3 unidentified bodies had been recovered from the lower levels, too damaged for immediate identification. The coroner's report, preserved in brittle photocopy, offered little clarity. Dental records had been requested, but results were inconclusive. Martha returned with a projector and a reel of microfilm. "This is from our Town Historical Society archives footage shot the week before the fire." The machine hummed to life, projecting grainy images onto the wall. A charity gala at Silver Pines, men in tuxedos, women in evening gowns, champagne flowing freely. The camera panned across the ballroom, capturing snippets of Minnesota's elite at play. Then the image shifted to 3 men standing near the grand staircase. Victor Reynolds, tall and commanding, silver-haired even then. Beside him, Robert Mitchell, younger than in the photo. Sarah had found his expression serious despite the festivities. The third man, younger than the others, with sharp features and cold eyes, was labeled in the caption as Douglas Reynolds, Victor's younger brother. There was a resemblance Sarah couldn't ignore. Douglas Reynolds' face was an older version of Mayor Montgomery's. The connection formed immediately in her mind. Martha confirmed it with a whisper. Douglas Reynolds was Wallace Montgomery's father. Changed his name after the fire, said he wanted nothing to do with his brother's legacy. But everyone knew the truth. Martha hesitated, then leaned closer. "You're Robert Mitchell's daughter-in-law, aren't you?" When Sarah nodded, the old woman's expression softened. "I thought I recognized something when you walked in. Your husband, Marcus Jr., never knew the truth about his father, did he? Robert wanted to expose them." Martha's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He had evidence of what the Reynolds brothers were doing, money laundering through the resort, bribing officials, Worse things that never made the papers. The night of the fire, he was planning to take his evidence to the FBI. They said he died in the fire, but some folks always wondered. As Sarah drove back to Silver Pines, her mind raced with implications. The pieces were beginning to align: Montgomery's desperate attempt to buy the property, the sealed room, the deliberately cut wires. Her father-in-law hadn't died in an accident. He'd been silenced. And now, 40 years later, his son's widow had unwittingly purchased the scene of the crime. The winter sun was already setting when she arrived back at the lodge, casting long shadows across the snow. Inside, the workers had made significant progress. Debris cleared temporary patches on the worst roof leaks, one of the fireplaces restored to working condition. Jim approached with good news. The main structure was sound despite the fire damage. With proper repairs, Silver Pines could stand for another century. Sarah found Emma and Thomas in what had once been the casino area, staring at something that made her blood run cold. One of the antique slot machines, a massive oak and brass contraption, was running lights, flickering reels spinning, though no electricity flowed to this part of the building. As they watched, the mechanism stopped with a mechanical click, and silver tokens began spilling into the collection tray. "I didn't touch it, Mom. It just started by itself." Thomas's voice was barely audible over the clinking of metal. The machine's lights flickered again, then went dark. Sarah approached, cautiously examining the tokens that had spilled out. They matched the one Thomas had found earlier, Silver Pines 1979, stamped on one side, the intertwined V and RR on the other. She reached out to touch the machine, finding the metal ice cold despite its recent activity. Emma's face had gone pale. "I think this place remembers, Mom, like it's trying to tell us something." Later that evening, Frank returned with Harold Jenkins, a lean, weathered man in his 70s with alert eyes and military posture. Harold had been Pinewood's police chief during the years Silver Pines operated, forced into early retirement shortly after the fire. He carried a cardboard box filled with documents, which he set on the reception desk with ceremonial care. "I kept copies of everything: the original fire reports, witness statements, photos the insurance company tried to bury." Harold spread the papers across the desk. "They pushed me out when I asked too many questions about the bodies they found. 3 dead, they claimed, but the dental records never matched anyone who worked here. And the 2 missing men, Reynolds and Mitchell, their cars were still in the parking lot, but no remains were ever conclusively identified as theirs." "I knew your father-in-law, Mrs. Mitchell." Harold's gaze met Sarah's with uncomfortable intensity. "He was an honest man in a dishonest operation. Started as Reynolds' accountant, became a partner when he helped expand the lodge. But then he discovered what was really happening behind the scenes." Harold explained how Silver Pines had been built with a complex system of secret passages and rooms. During Prohibition, the original hunting lodge on this site had been used to smuggle Canadian whiskey across the border. Reynolds had maintained and expanded those features, creating a hidden infrastructure ideal for moving money and conducting business away from public eyes. The green room wasn't just for private poker games. Harold tapped a faded blueprint. It was where Reynolds met with politicians, judges, business competitors. Your father-in-law discovered they were using the resort to launder money from Reynolds' less legitimate businesses. When he threatened to expose them, Emma had been exploring the service areas behind the bar and called out excitedly. She'd found a narrow corridor hidden behind a panel of decorative molding, accessible through what appeared to be a service entrance. The passage was tight, designed for staff to move unseen through the resort. It led to a narrow staircase descending below the main floor level. Sarah, Harold, and Frank followed Emma down the stairs, flashlight beams cutting through decades of dust. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying the musty scent of undisturbed space. The staircase ended at a corridor that stretched into darkness. Their lights revealed a section of wall different from the rest, newer brick, different mortar color. Frank confirmed Sarah's suspicion. "That's the entrance to the green room. They sealed it after the fire. Didn't want anyone finding what was left inside." Sarah ran her hand over the bricks. The truth about her father-in-law, perhaps the truth about the fire itself, lay on the other side of this wall. She turned to the men. "How soon can we break through this?" Jim and his crew arrived early the next morning, equipped with tools for removing the brick wall. They worked methodically, carefully extracting each brick to avoid damaging what might lie beyond. As the opening grew larger, a rush of stale air escaped, carrying the lingering scent of old smoke, and something else, the metallic odor of secrets long contained. The workers stepped back as the last bricks fell away, revealing a dark opening. Sarah was the first to step through, her flashlight illuminating what had once been the notorious green room. The space was larger than she'd expected, a rectangular chamber with high ceilings and no windows. Two large metal tables stood bolted to the floor, their surfaces warped by intense heat. The walls bore the blackened fingerprints of flames that had consumed everything combustible, leaving only the skeletal remains of chairs and filing cabinets. In one corner stood a safe, its door hanging open, contents long removed. Papers were scattered across the floor, most reduced to ash, though some remained partially legible. Sarah knelt carefully, lifting a charred document. The letterhead was still visible, Reynolds Enterprises, along with fragments of what appeared to be financial records. Thomas examined the room with clinical detachment, pointing out the fire's path. It started here. He indicated a section of wall where the burn patterns radiated outward like a dark sun. Someone poured accelerant along this wall. You can see how the burn pattern is different, hotter, more intense. And look, he pointed to melted remnants of what might have been a gas can. They left evidence behind. Emma discovered a filing cabinet partially protected by its position behind a fallen beam. Inside were folders, their edges crisped and crumbling, but their contents largely intact. She carefully removed them, laying the documents on one of the metal tables. The papers contained contracts, receipts, and typed lists of names, local politicians, bank executives, law enforcement officials. Beside each name were handwritten notes: approved, paid, or delayed. In one folder, Sarah found something that stopped her breath: a series of photographs showing Reynolds and Mitchell shaking hands with a third man whose face had been deliberately burned out of the image. Behind them, uniformed staff carried trays of champagne. She turned the photos over and found the same looping handwriting: new investors confirmed, no witnesses. Another page contained a letter half burned at the edges, signed with the initials .dr. The message was clear. You took what was not yours. You built your fortune on deceit. If the fire doesn't cleanse it, I will. The handwriting was sharp and aggressive, each stroke pressed deep into the page as though carved by rage. Harold examined the documents, his expression grim. Douglas Reynolds. He never approved of his brother's methods, but he wasn't above using them when it suited his purposes. They had a falling out weeks before the fire, something about property rights and profit shares. Douglas vanished afterward, resurfaced years later as Montgomery, changed his name but kept the money and connections. As they continued searching the room, Thomas noticed a small metal plate bolted to the floor near one of the tables. Brushing away decades of ash revealed a manufacturer's mark and serial number. Thomas's mechanical mind immediately understood its significance. This was an anchor point for recording equipment. They were recording their meetings, probably had microphones under the table. If they recorded their meetings, Sarah's mind raced with the implication, then there must be tapes somewhere. The search took on new urgency. Harold found a panel in the floor that sounded hollow when tapped. With Jim's help, they pried it open, revealing a small storage space. Inside was a metal box, blackened by smoke, but intact. Sarah lifted it out carefully, setting it on the table. The lock had been warped by heat, but Thomas managed to force it open with a screwdriver. Inside lay several magnetic tape reels, their plastic cases partially melted, but the tapes themselves protected. Labels had burned away from most, but one still bore a handwritten date: July 15th, 1979, the night of the fire. A scratching sound near the entrance made them all turn. Wallace Montgomery stood in the doorway, his face contorted with barely controlled fury. Behind him, a uniformed officer, younger, but with the same cold eyes, watched with hand resting on his holstered weapon. I see you've been busy, Mrs. Mitchell. Montgomery's voice dripped with false civility. My brother, Chief Montgomery, and I were just stopping by to inform you of some urgent safety violations. His gaze swept the room, lingering on the documents spread across the table. Though it appears you've found something more interesting than building codes. Harold stepped forward, placing himself between Montgomery and Sarah. You have no jurisdiction here, Wallace. This is private property now. Montgomery's smile never reached his eyes. Oh, I think we have every jurisdiction when it comes to hazardous structures inhabited by a woman and two minor children. His attention returned to Sarah. My offer still stands: $5,000, a generous amount for a death trap like this. His gaze flicked meaningfully to the exposed brick where they'd broken through the wall, especially one with so many structural modifications. Sarah held her ground. I'm not selling, especially now that I know what you're really after. Her hand rested protectively on the box of tapes. The police chief, Brian Montgomery, shifted uncomfortably, his expression less certain than his brother's. "Wallace, we should go. This isn't the way to handle this." His eyes moved over the room, taking in the evidence of deliberate arson, the documents, the recording equipment anchor. "We can come back with proper warrants." Wallace's face flushed with anger, but he composed himself quickly. "Very well. But I should warn you, Mrs. Mitchell, the township building inspector will be here tomorrow morning. I'd be surprised if he finds this place suitable for habitation, especially with children present." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, where did you say you found those interesting documents? I'd hate to think you've been removing evidence from a historical crime scene." After they left, Harold helped Sarah secure the documents and tapes in Emma's backpack. "You need to hide these somewhere safe, not in the lodge. Montgomery will be back with warrants, and they'll tear this place apart looking for anything that connects his family to the fire." Sarah nodded, the weight of their discovery settling heavily on her shoulders. She sent the children to the truck with the backpack, then turned to Harold. "I need to understand what's on those tapes. Do you know anyone who can play them?" Harold thought for a moment. "Old Bill Henderson still has a reel-to-reel setup, runs the radio station in Grand Falls. It's about 40 miles north. We could go tomorrow while Montgomery's inspector is here. Jim and the boys will keep an eye on things." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The lodge groaned around them as the temperature dropped, ice forming in delicate patterns across the inside of windows. She sat by the fire in the main hall, examining the photographs they'd found. Robert Mitchell's face looked back at her, her husband's face with 20 more years of life etched into it. A man she had never met, but whose legacy now entangled her family. Thomas had spent the evening working on an old tube radio he'd found in one of the storerooms, meticulously cleaning connections and replacing corroded wires. By midnight, he'd managed to get it working well enough to pick up static and occasional fragments of distant stations. "I think I can modify it to play the tapes." His small hands moved confidently among the radio's components. "The basic mechanics are similar. If we can't get to Mr. Henderson tomorrow, we might be able to hear them anyway." Emma sat at the reception desk, her sketchbooks spread around her, designing renovations with the passion of someone who had found her purpose. She had already mapped every room they'd discovered, noting structural damage and prioritizing repairs. "If Montgomery succeeds in condemning this place, we'll fight it." Her voice carried the same quiet determination that had once been her father's. "This is ours now. We won't let them take it away." Sarah nodded, though worry gnawed at her. Their funds were nearly depleted. The workers had agreed to minimal payment now, with promises of more when the lodge became operational. But fighting legal battles against the town's most powerful family would require resources they didn't have. Morning brought the promised inspection. A thin man in an official-looking parka arrived, clipboard in hand, Montgomery's SUV idling in the background. The inspector moved through the building with obvious discomfort, checking electrical systems, structural integrity, heating capability. Jim and his crew followed, pointing out the improvements already made, explaining their renovation plans. Sarah, meanwhile, slipped away with Harold, taking Emma's backpack containing the tapes and documents. They drove north to Grand Falls, the highway cutting through snow-covered forests like a black ribbon. The radio station was a small building on the town's main street, its antenna rising above neighboring storefronts. Bill Henderson was in his 70s, with thick glasses and hearing aids in both ears, ironic for a man who had spent his life working with sound. He greeted Harold warmly, ushering them into a studio filled with equipment from various decades, from vintage to modern. Sarah explained their discovery, showing him the tapes. Bill examined them carefully. "These are in rough shape, but salvageable." His fingers moved over the spools with practiced care. "The heat damaged the outer layers, but the inner recordings should be intact. Let's see what we've got." He mounted the first tape on a massive reel-to-reel player, adjusting settings with the precision of a surgeon. The machine hummed to life reels, turning slowly as Bill fine-tuned the playback heads. At first, there was only static and the occasional warp sound. Then suddenly, voices emerged from the noise, distorted but recognizable. First, a man's voice, calm but tense. "We can't hide this anymore, Victor. The FBI is already asking questions about the Chicago accounts." Another voice, sharper, more authoritative. "They have nothing concrete. As long as we stick to the story." A third voice interrupted, angry and familiar, even through the distortion. "Douglas Reynolds. The story won't hold if your partner decides to play hero. Mitchell's been making copies of the ledgers. I've seen him." The recording continued, the conversation growing more heated. Victor Reynolds defending their operations, Douglas accusing his brother of sloppiness, a fourth voice occasionally interjecting with legal concerns. Then Robert Mitchell's voice again firm and resolute. I won't be part of this anymore. Too many people have been hurt. If it burns, it burns. Victor's cold reply sent chills through Sarah. Then let it burn. It's the only way to erase the evidence. Douglas's voice, almost inaudible. Take care of Mitchell. No witnesses. The tape continued for several more minutes, capturing the sound of a door slamming, then footsteps followed by the unmistakable sound of liquid being poured and a match being struck. The recording ended with the first crackling sounds of fire. Sarah sat in stunned silence. They had just heard the planning of her father-in-law's murder and the deliberate destruction of Silver Pines. Bill rewound the tape, his expression grave. You need to take this to the state police, not local. Montgomery's reach doesn't extend that far. Harold agreed but cautioned patience. We need more than this. The tape proves arson and implicates the Reynolds brothers, but there's 40 years of distance. Wallace could claim it was doctored, that we found it elsewhere. We need something that ties him directly to the cover-up. When they returned to Silver Pines, they found the inspector gone and Jim looking troubled. He didn't condemn the place outright, couldn't with the progress we've made, but he's requiring permits for every repair, inspections at each stage. It's harassment, plain and simple. Montgomery's trying to bury you in red tape. Inside, Thomas had news of his own. He'd discovered something while examining the office safe more carefully. The combination dial had a small keyhole beneath it, a master override. Most high-security safes from that era had them. If we could find the key, we might be able to open it without the combination. Emma had spent the day exploring the upstairs rooms more thoroughly. In what had been Victor Reynolds' private suite, she found a hidden panel behind the headboard of the massive bed frame. Inside was a small compartment containing a brass key with the initials VR engraved on it. Sarah examined the key, turning it over in her palm. The weight of it felt significant, as if it might unlock more than just the safe. They hurried to the office where Thomas carefully inserted the key into the hidden keyhole beneath the combination dial. It fit perfectly, turning with a solid click. The safe mechanism released and the heavy door swung open. Inside was not the cache of valuables they might have expected, but something far more valuable. A leather portfolio containing documents, more tapes, and a hand-drawn map on architectural paper. The map detailed the lower levels of Silver Pines, showing passages and rooms that didn't appear on the official blueprints. One area was circled in red ink labeled Sublevel Private Access with a note scrawled at the bottom in case of emergency. Sarah spread the map on the desk, tracing the outlined passages with her finger. According to this, there's another level beneath the green room, a secure storage area accessed through a hidden entrance in the floor. Harold studied the map, recognition dawning in his eyes. The rumors were true. Reynolds had a panic room built during the Cold War, supposed to withstand anything short of a direct nuclear strike. If there's evidence still intact, it would be down there. Thomas pointed to notations on the map indicating mechanical systems. Look at this separate ventilation-independent water supply. That's what the second set of pipes was for. This place was designed to be self-sufficient, even if the main building was compromised. Sarah felt a surge of determination. If Reynolds had a secure room designed to protect his most valuable possessions, then perhaps the answers they sought had been preserved there all along, waiting 40 years for someone to find them. The key to proving what happened to Robert Mitchell, to understanding why Montgomery was so desperate to acquire the property, might lie just beneath their feet. As darkness fell, they gathered in the green room, the map spread across one of the metal tables. Emma had calculated the precise location of the hidden entrance based on the measurements provided. It should be here. She pointed to a section of flooring near the far wall, unmarked by any obvious access panel. Thomas knelt, running his hands over the concrete floor, searching for seams or irregularities. Nothing was immediately apparent. The fire had damaged the surface, obscuring any patterns that might have indicated a door. He sat back on his heels thinking, if I designed this, I wouldn't make the entrance obvious. It would be triggered by a mechanism elsewhere in the room. They began a methodical search, examining every remaining fixture, every bolt and screw in the walls and floor. It was Harold who finally found a small brass fitting in the baseboard that looked like an ordinary electrical outlet cover. When pressed in sequence, three short, two long, a section of the floor nearby made a faint hydraulic sound. A rectangular portion of concrete approximately 3 feet by 4 feet recessed slightly into the floor, revealing metal handles embedded in its surface. Jim and Frank helped lift the heavy panel away, exposing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cold air rose from that opening, carrying the scent of metal and paper, a time capsule sealed for 4 decades. Sarah prepared to descend, flashlight in hand, when they heard vehicles outside, multiple engines, doors slamming, voices calling out orders. Through the windows they could see police cruisers, their light bars painting the snow in alternating red and blue. Wallace Montgomery had returned this time with reinforcements and presumably warrants. Hide the map. Sarah handed the leather portfolio to Emma. Take everything we found in the safe and go with Thomas. Use the service passage behind the bar. It should lead to the kitchen exit. Get to the truck and drive to Bill Henderson's in Grand Falls. Call the state police from there. Emma protested, unwilling to leave her mother behind. We can all go together. Sarah shook her head. Someone needs to stall them or they'll tear this place apart looking for what we found. They might even seal the entrance again before we can discover what's down there. Harold will make sure I'm safe. Her gaze met her daughter's, brooking no argument. This is what your grandfather would have done, protected the truth at all costs. As Emma and Thomas reluctantly departed with the evidence, Sarah and Harold prepared to face Montgomery. Jim and his workers positioned themselves throughout the lodge, ready to bear witness to whatever might transpire. Frank took up position near the hidden passage, prepared to secure it if necessary. Sarah climbed the stairs to the main hall just as the front doors burst open. Wallace Montgomery entered first, followed by his brother in full police uniform and 4 deputies. Behind them came a man in a suit carrying a briefcase, a lawyer by the look of him. Mrs. Mitchell. Montgomery's smile was shark-like. I have here a court order authorizing a complete inspection of these premises for evidence related to the 1979 fire. It seems some historical artifacts may have been tampered with. His gaze swept the hall, searching for signs of their discoveries. I trust you'll cooperate fully. Sarah maintained her composure, though her heart raced. Of course, Mayor Montgomery, though I'm curious about your sudden interest in historical preservation, especially considering your family's connection to the original owners. Montgomery's smile faltered momentarily. Ancient history, Mrs. Mitchell. My concern is merely for proper procedure. Chief, begin the search. His brother nodded to the deputies who spread out through the building. Sarah led them on a deliberate tour, moving slowly through areas they had already cleared, answering questions with careful vagueness, buying time for Emma and Thomas to get safely away. Harold followed silently, his presence, a reassuring anchor in the increasing tension. They reached the green room last. Montgomery entered first, his expression darkening when he saw the exposed brick entrance, breaking through sealed walls without permits. That's a serious installation, Mrs. Mitchell. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the metal tables, the evidence of their investigations finally settling on the open floor panel, revealing the staircase. What have we here? Sarah said. Nothing, as Montgomery approached the opening, peering down into the darkness. His brother joined him, flashlight beam probing the descending stairs. Wallace's face showed a complex mixture of emotions, triumph, concern, calculation. How convenient that you've discovered this just now. Montgomery turned back to Sarah, suspicion evident in his tone. What exactly were you planning to do with whatever's down there? Learn the truth. Sarah met his gaze unflinchingly. About the fire, about what happened to Robert Mitchell, about why you're so desperate to own this property after all these years. Montgomery's composed facade cracked slightly. You're meddling in matters you don't understand, Mrs. Mitchell. Some secrets are better left buried. His voice lowered, meant only for her ears. Your father-in-law made the same mistake, thinking the truth would protect him. It didn't. Before Sarah could respond, there was a commotion from upstairs. One of the deputies called down, his voice urgent. Chief, we've got state police pulling up outside. 4 vehicles, marked and unmarked. Montgomery's face paled. He exchanged a glance with his brother, silent communication passing between them. The chief nodded slightly, then turned to his deputies. Continue the search according to the warrant. He headed upstairs, leaving Sarah and Wallace facing each other across the exposed entrance to the sublevel. It seems we have company. Sarah couldn't keep the satisfaction from her voice. Perhaps they'd like to join our historical exploration. Montgomery's eyes narrowed, calculations visibly running behind them. This isn't over, Mrs. Mitchell. Silver Pines has buried secrets before. His threat hung in the air between them as he turned and followed his brother upstairs. Sarah stood at the edge of the opening, staring down into the darkness. The answers were down there. She could feel it with certainty that transcended logic. Whatever Robert Mitchell had discovered, whatever evidence he had gathered against the Reynolds brothers, would be preserved in that cold, sealed space. The truth that had cost him his life might finally come to light. Harold joined her at the edge, his weathered face set with determination. Ready. She nodded, and together they began descending the narrow stairs, flashlight beams cutting through 40 years of darkness, revealing the next chapter of Silver Pine's long-buried secrets. The air in the narrow stairwell grew colder with each step downward. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through darkness that hadn't been disturbed in 4 decades, revealing concrete walls without a hint of fire damage. Unlike the upper levels of Silver Pines, this place had been sealed off, completely protected from both the flames and the passing of time. Their footsteps echoed in the enclosed space, counting down their descent into the lodge's final secrets. The staircase ended at a metal door, not ornate like the ones upstairs, but industrial and utilitarian, with a simple locking mechanism that had seized with age. Harold pressed his shoulder against it, the door reluctantly yielding with a deep groan of protesting hinges. The sound reverberated through the enclosed space like the last breath of something long dormant finally escaping. Sarah's light swept across the room beyond, revealing a chamber unlike any other part of Silver Pines. The walls were lined with steel panels rather than wood or stone, the ceiling reinforced with metal beams. This wasn't just storage, it was a vault, a bunker designed to withstand destruction from above. The air carried a metallic tang and the faint scent of old paper and film. At the center of the room stood a massive safe, far larger than the one in the office, its surface unmarked by heat or smoke. Beside it sat rows of filing cabinets, some open, others still sealed. Against the far wall, a desk held an old reel-to-reel recording system connected to a phone line, the receiving end of the microphones Thomas had identified in the green room. Sarah moved toward the filing cabinets, first pulling open a drawer to find folders arranged with meticulous precision. Each contained financial records, correspondence, and photographs documenting the hidden operations of Silver Pines Lodge. Names leapt out from the pines of state senators, judges, bank executives, all connected to Victor Reynolds through contracts, payments, and blackmail material. These people built their careers on Reynolds' money. Harold's voice was hushed with disbelief as he examined a folder. Every major appointment in the county for 20 years passed through this room first. No wonder Montgomery's desperate to destroy it all. In the center of the desk lay a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the intertwined V and R that had become familiar. Sarah opened it carefully, finding pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. The final entry was dated July 15, 1979, the day of the fire. She read aloud the words, bringing Victor Reynolds back to life in the sealed chamber. Robert has forced my hand. His ultimatum: surrender our records to federal authorities, or he exposes everything, leaves no acceptable option. Douglas suggests a clean slate. Fire purifies, he says. What my brother doesn't understand is that some sins leave ashes that never cool. I've made arrangements should the worst happen. Not everything will burn. Sarah turned the page to find a sealed envelope addressed simply, "In the event of my disappearance." She broke the brittle seal, unfolding the paper inside to reveal a confession, detailed, damning, and signed by Victor Reynolds himself. The document acknowledged the money laundering operation, the bribery of officials, and most crucially named Douglas Reynolds as the architect of the plan to silence Robert Mitchell. You should see this. Harold had moved to the safe, which stood partially open. Inside were stacks of cash, now worthless with age, but beneath them lay something far more valuable: dozens of reels of tape, each labeled with dates and names. One section was marked insurance and contained recordings of every meeting held in the green room over a 5-year period. Another stack of folders contained original property deeds and legal documents related to Silver Pines. Sarah lifted out a thick manila envelope marked PAE Contingency Ownership. And inside was a formal transfer of property, notarized and legally binding, transferring complete ownership of Silver Pines Lodge to Robert Mitchell in the event of Victor Reynolds' death or disappearance. The document bore both men's signatures and had never been filed with the county. He tried to make it right. Sarah's throat tightened as she realized the implications. Victor knew what his brother was planning. This was his attempt at redemption, ensuring the lodge would go to the one honest man in their operation if anything happened to him. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made them both turn. Wallace Montgomery stood in the doorway alone, his expression unreadable in the dim light. His gaze moved over the room's contents, lingering on the open safe and the documents in Sarah's hands. His shoulders sagged slightly, the posture of a man seeing inevitable defeat approach. I always wondered if Uncle Victor had a backup plan. Montgomery stepped into the room, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He was always the careful one, always 3 steps ahead, even at the end. Harold moved protectively towards Sarah, but Montgomery waved him off. No need for theatrics. The state police are upstairs with my brother. Apparently your children delivered quite a compelling case to them. His smile held no humor. 40 years of careful work undone by a widow and 2 kids. My father would be livid. Sarah held up the property transfer. According to this, Silver Pines legally belonged to Robert Mitchell after your uncle disappeared. It should have gone to my husband, then to me. You knew that all along. Montgomery nodded, his admission surprising in its frankness. I suspected something like this existed. That's why I've been trying to buy this place for years, waiting for the state to finally auction it off. When you appeared with your ridiculous $170 bid, his laugh was hollow, echoing in the metal-lined room. Do you have any idea what's hidden in these walls? The careers that would end if certain conversations became public. Before Sarah could respond, more footsteps sounded on the stairs. Brian Montgomery appeared accompanied by 2 state police officers. The police chief's face showed strain, but also something Sarah hadn't seen before resolution. He approached his brother, official professionalism masking whatever personal conflict churned beneath. Wallace Montgomery, you're under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice evidence, tampering, and accessory after the fact in relation to the death of Robert Mitchell. Brian's voice remained steady as he recited the charges. The recording your son repaired was quite clear, Mrs. Mitchell. Douglas Reynolds ordered your father-in-law's death, and Wallace here helped cover it up. The older Montgomery didn't resist as his brother recited his rights. His only reaction was a glance toward the safe, a look of resignation crossing his features. It was never about the money, you know. It was about the legacy. This place was supposed to be our family's crowning achievement. His gaze swept the bunker with its evidence of corruption. Instead, it became our mausoleum. As the officers led Montgomery away, Sarah and Harold continued their exploration of the vault. In a locked drawer, they found Robert Mitchell's personal effects, his wallet keys, and a letter addressed to his son Marcus. Sarah opened it with trembling fingers, reading the last words her father-in-law had written. Marcus, if you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong. I've discovered that the business I helped build has become corrupted beyond salvation. I've gathered evidence and plan to contact federal authorities tomorrow. Victor has agreed to cooperate, but Douglas remains a threat. Whatever happens, know that I tried to do what was right. The lodge should have been your inheritance, a place built with honest work, not with the currency of influence and fear. Forgive me for the legacy I've left you to untangle. With love, your father. Sarah folded the letter carefully, tucking it into her pocket. Marcus had never received these words, never known his father had died trying to expose corruption rather than participating in it, but she could ensure that Thomas and Emma understood the grandfather they had never met, a man who had chosen integrity over safety. The evidence from the vault proved decisive. Over the next weeks, state and federal authorities poured through the files, building cases against surviving participants in the Reynolds operation. Wallace Montgomery confessed to helping cover up his father's crimes, trading his testimony for a reduced sentence. The truth about the fire that Douglas Reynolds had ordered it to silence Robert Mitchell and destroy evidence, while Victor Reynolds had secretly prepared this vault as insurance, finally emerged into the light. Sarah filed the property transfer, with the county establishing clear legal ownership of Silver Pines Lodge. With Montgomery's power broken, the township's harassment ended. The building inspector, who had been so reluctant before, now expedited permits for renovation, eager to distance himself from the previous administration. Winter gave way to spring snow, melting to reveal the full scope of the lodge's grounds, or 20 acres of pine forest surrounding a private lake. As the weather warmed, work accelerated. The roof was repaired, the electrical system modernized, plumbing restored to functionality. Jim and his crew worked with renewed purpose, many volunteering extra hours without pay. This was no longer just another job, it had become a community project. the resurrection of a local landmark tainted by corruption, now being cleansed through honest labor. Emma's designs guided the restoration, preserving the original character while adapting spaces for new purposes. The casino area became a community gathering space. The ballroom was restored to its former glory for weddings and celebrations, and the green room, source of so much secrecy, was transformed into a small museum, documenting both the lodge's glamorous past and its darker chapters. Thomas focused on the technical systems, his natural talent for mechanics blossoming as he worked alongside electricians and plumbers. He designed an integrated sound system that connected all public spaces while retaining the original speakers from the 1950s. When he successfully restored the grand clock in the main hall, setting it ticking for the first time in 40 years, the workers stopped to applaud, recognizing in this small moment the larger rebirth taking place around them. By late summer, Silver Pines had been transformed. The blackened timbers were replaced, the broken windows restored with energy-efficient reproductions of the original stained glass. The sign above the entrance was carefully rebuilt, the gold leaf lettering reapplied by a local artisan. Only the name changed, no longer Silver Pines Lodge, but Silver Pines Community Center, reflecting its new purpose as a space that belonged to everyone rather than an exclusive playground for the powerful. Throughout this transformation, Sarah felt the building responding as if the structure itself approved of their efforts. The strange occurrences that had marked their early days, mysterious footsteps, lights that operated without power, the sense of being watched gradually faded. Occasionally, Thomas would mention hearing piano music late at night when no one was playing, or Emma would capture an unexplained figure in the background of a photograph. But these manifestations no longer felt threatening, more like approving nods from the past. The day before the grand reopening, Sarah received an unexpected package from the state police. Inside was a small brass key with the initials RM engraved on it, recovered from Douglas Reynolds' personal effects after his death. A note explained that forensic examination had confirmed it was taken from Robert Mitchell's body the night of the fire. Sarah recognized it immediately, the match to Victor's key, the other half of the set that had once opened every door in Silver Pines. She placed the key in the shadow box along with her father-in-law's letter and the photograph of him with Victor Reynolds, creating a small memorial in the entrance hall. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "For Robert Mitchell, who valued truth above safety and integrity above profit." The morning of the reopening dawned clear and bright, the Minnesota summer at its finest. Cars began arriving before the scheduled time, filling the newly graveled parking area and lining the access road. It seemed the entire township had turned out, along with the reporters from Minneapolis and visitors from surrounding counties. The story of Silver Pines, its corrupt past, fiery destruction, and remarkable resurrection had captured public imagination. Sarah stood on the front steps, Emma and Thomas beside her, watching the crowd gather. Her children had been transformed as surely as the building behind them. Emma, her portfolio of designs now substantial enough to secure a college scholarship, stood taller, confidence, replacing the hesitancy that had marked her in their trailer park days. Thomas, his mechanical aptitude recognized and nurtured by the restoration team, had developed a poise unusual in an 11-year-old, his inherent kindness now matched with earned self-assurance. For a brief, piercing moment, Sarah wished Marcus could see them, could see what their children had become, what she had managed to build from the ruins of their life together. The ache of his absence would never fully heal, but it had changed, becoming less a wound and more a foundation upon which something new could stand. At precisely noon, Sarah cut the ribbon stretched across the entrance. The crowd surged forward, eager to see the restored interior. Emma led guided tours of the main facilities, explaining the architectural choices with professional precision. Thomas demonstrated the technical systems, showing how modern technology had been integrated with historical elements. Community leaders expressed amazement at the transformation, many offering partnerships for future programs. Brian Montgomery attended in civilian clothes, having resigned his position as police chief to run for county commissioner on a platform of transparency and accountability. He approached Sarah as the festivities were in full swing, his manner tentative, seeking neither forgiveness nor friendship, but perhaps understanding. "Wallace asked me to give you a message." Brian's voice was quiet, nearly lost in the celebratory noise around them. "He said you were right about this place having a soul, that it chose you, not the other way around. He said some buildings hold on to the truth until the right person comes to hear it." Sarah nodded, accepting the message without comment. The brothers' relationship had been another casualty of the truth, though perhaps a necessary one. Brian turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, I think you've created something remarkable here. Something that might finally wash away the stain my family left on this town. His gaze swept over the crowded hall, the laughter and conversation filling spaces once dominated by secrets and corruption. More than a building was buried under that fire. Maybe more than a building has been restored. Late that evening, after the last visitors had departed and the cleanup was complete, Sarah found herself alone in the main hall. The moonlight spilled through the stained glass windows, painting the polished floors with pools of colored light. She sat on the grand staircase, listening to the building settle around her, the comfortable sounds of a structure at peace with itself. A movement caught her eye, a figure standing by the entrance to what had been the green room. In the dimness, she could make out the shape of a man in a suit watching her. For once, she felt no fear, no urgency to explain the apparition. Instead, she nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The figure remained a moment longer, then seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Sarah didn't need to see his face to know who it had been. Robert Mitchell, finally at rest, his legacy secured not through buildings or wealth, but through the truth he had died protecting. In that moment, she understood that her purchase of Silver Pines had never been accidental. Some connections transcended time and circumstance, drawing together loose threads across generations to complete a pattern begun long ago. 1 year later, Silver Pines Community Center had become the heart of the township. The ballroom hosted weddings and quinceañeras, community dances, and charity events. The dining hall served as a gathering place for senior citizens during weekdays and transformed into a youth center on evenings and weekends. The former casino space housed art exhibitions, farmers markets, and town meetings. Emma had left for college on a full architectural scholarship, her portfolio of Silver Pines renovations, impressing admissions officers at programs that had once seemed unattainable. She returned for holidays and summer breaks, always with new ideas for improving the space, her talent maturing with formal education. Thomas had become something of a local celebrity, the boy who could fix anything mechanical. He split his time between school and apprenticing with the gym's contracting company, his understanding of buildings and their systems growing more sophisticated with each project. The old radio from Silver Pines, now fully restored, sat in his bedroom, occasionally picking up transmissions that no modern station broadcasted big band music and news reports from decades past, as if time itself had thin spots within the lodge's walls. Sarah found her own unexpected path forward. What had begun as desperate survival became purposeful renovation and ultimately a career. She now managed Silver Pines full-time, coordinating its programs and continuing restoration of the outlying cabins that had once housed the lodge's most exclusive guests. These would become affordable housing for seniors and young families, extending the property's transformation beyond its main building. The township flourished alongside Silver Pines. Tourism increased as people came to see the historic building with its remarkable story. New businesses opened in the previously struggling downtown. The culture of secrecy and favoritism that had characterized local government gave way to transparency and community involvement, with regular town halls held in the very space where corrupt deals had once been negotiated. Brian Montgomery won his election, guiding the county toward reconciliation with its past, rather than bearing uncomfortable truths. Wallace served his reduced sentence, declining parole hearings and interview requests, apparently content to fade from public consciousness. The final chapter of the Reynolds legacy was written not by descendants seeking to protect their power, but by the community reclaiming its stolen trust. On cold winter nights when snow blanketed the grounds and wind whispered through the pines, Sarah sometimes walked alone through the quiet halls of Silver Pines. The grand staircase no longer creaked ominously underfoot, but welcomed her steps like an old friend recognizing a familiar tread. The fireplaces burned cheerfully in public spaces, their warmth reaching into corners that had known only cold and darkness for decades. Occasionally, she would stop at the memorial to Robert Mitchell, straightening the frame containing his photograph or polishing the brass key in its display case. These small gestures felt like conversation across time, acknowledgement of the strange connection that had brought her family to this place at precisely the moment its secrets were ready to emerge. During one such evening walk, Sarah noticed light coming from the ballroom, though she knew the building was empty. She approached quietly, pushing the door open to find the massive chandelier illuminated, though the power had been turned off for the night. In the center of the wooden dance floor, a single token from the old casino spun on its edge, turning with impossible balance before finally coming to rest. Sarah picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in her palm. The V and R intertwined on its surface caught the light, but instead of representing Victor Reynolds as she had always assumed, she suddenly understood they could equally stand for vindication and restoration, the twin purposes that had driven Silverpine's rebirth. She pocketed the token and turned off the chandelier with the newly installed switch, no longer questioning how it had activated itself. Silver Pines had always operated by its own rules, keeping its mysteries close while revealing just enough truth to move forward. The building had become more than a structure of timber and stone. It was a repository of memory, both dark and light, holding space for a community to confront its past and reimagine its future. The grand reopening celebration became an annual tradition, marking not just the renovation of a building, but the renewal of a community spirit. The second year brought twice the attendance of the first, with former employees of the original lodge traveling from across the country to share stories and reconcile with their own connections to the complicated legacy of Silver Pines. During that second celebration, as summer sunshine streamed through restored windows and children played on the grounds once reserved for the wealthy elite, Sarah stood on the portico overlooking it all. Emma had returned from college for the event, her architectural studies giving her new appreciation for what they had accomplished. Thomas proudly demonstrated the antique slot machine he had restored to working order, though it now dispensed commemorative tokens rather than accepting them. A reporter approached Sarah, notepad in hand, asking what she considered the most significant aspect of Silver Pine's transformation. Sarah considered the question, her gaze moving from the building to the people gathered around it, then to her children, who carried forward the legacy of a grandfather they had never known, but whose principles they embodied. The most valuable restoration wasn't in the building itself, Sarah finally answered. It was in the truth. Secrets are like dry rot. They weaken foundations from within until one day everything collapses. What we've built here stands on something stronger than timber and stone. It stands on honesty, however difficult, and on the belief that confronting our darkest chapters is the only way to write better ones. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the summer twilight lingered, Sarah walked to the edge of the property where the forest met the manicured lawn. The original sign from the lodge entrance had been preserved and mounted there, where dreams endure forever. Its message no longer an empty marketing slogan, but a testament to resilience and redemption. As she turned back toward the building, she saw it illuminated against the darkening sky, every window glowing with warm light that spilled onto the surrounding grounds. The sight caught in her throat not just the physical beauty of the restored structure, but the journey it represented. From abandoned ruin to community cornerstone, from repository of secrets to beacon of truth, Silver Pine stood as proof that some dreams do endure, even through fire and time, waiting only for someone brave enough to uncover them. In that moment, Sarah understood that her impulsive 170 bid had purchased far more than a building. It had bought her family's place, in a story larger than themselves, a chance to heal wounds that extended beyond their own lives. The true value of Silver Pines could never be measured in dollars or property deeds. It existed in the connections restored, the truths honored, and the community rebuilt around principles that would outlast any single generation. The lodge had chosen her, just as it had chosen Robert Mitchell decades before, recognizing in both of them the determination to face difficult truths rather than comfortable lies. That shared quality spanned time and blood relation, binding them together in a legacy that would continue through Emma and Thomas and beyond, into a future where Silver Pines would stand not as a monument to wealth and privilege, but as a testament to the enduring power of integrity. As darkness finally fell and the last guest departed, Sarah locked the massive front doors with Robert Mitchell's brass key. The mechanism turned smoothly, as if freshly oiled rather than dormant for 40 years. The sound echoed through the grand hall, not the finality of an ending, but the satisfying click of pieces falling perfectly into place.